Muli palakpakan natin Dr. Gregory Anderson for his reaction.
Okay. Well, not exactly sure what the reaction is supposed to entail. One of the things that I guess if I'm commenting on the papers that we heard earlier, well, first we heard some interesting, enheartening and encouraging reports from Michael Walsh about some very positive developments going on in the language revitalization domain in Aboriginal Australia, and some success stories that we can take heart in and reinforce our own activities when we're feeling doubt maybe that these are activities that are not going to lead to success, and what are we doing and what is the point of all this anyway. But then we hear stories about reclamation from highly eroded language communities and the sort of knock-on benefits that we see. It's an important lesson to learn and to be reminded of that really simple things like instilling pride in one's identity can have so many ramifications that affect not only on the micro level, but really on a macro level in many different ways. It's of course very standard for dominant language community members to say, what do we need all these languages for? Wouldn't it be better if everyone, just spoke blank English, for example? And, of course, because every war that's ever been fought in history has been solely and only caused by disagreements over language. So and no civil wars have ever been fought on language groups. So magically everyone understands each other and it's all harmonious when you speak the same language. All social ills go away, I guess. Obviously that's delusional nonsense. So it's good to be reinforced about, very little things that can help. And so then we heard maybe some slightly less encouraging information from me, talking about, one area in Asia that is in fact very bad off socially and linguistically in native Siberia. Life expectancy is very, very low among native Siberian people, so their lives are very difficult in many ways. It's sort of, prehistoric levels of life expectancies in some of these communities. Okay, 35 is like an old person. Then we heard some interesting approaches, mainly from a top-down, really sort of the ultimate top-down, that is the United Nations, kind of superordinate in a sense to all kind of national entities. And we can see the role of advisory boards or other policy making. So we heard some things about these important distinctions between drafting declarations and implementing conventions and this type of thing. In particular, we were encouraged to rightly consider linguistic rights to be, one of these unshakable fundamental human rights, and very cogently argued that identity, you have the right to your identity, and your language is your identity, so you really can't suppress language. I was struck by the comments, though not surprised, to hear that even among the 6 official languages of the UN, we see de facto language hierarchies at play, and that English seems to be first among equals in a global context, even in a body like the United Nations. And that reminded me of an issue that we have in the US, which was also alluded to, this nonsensical movement of English only. anyone who promotes English in the United States simply doesn't understand the dynamics of linguistic markets, okay? It's a monopoly already. So there's no reason to throw money at something that's already, the contest is basically over, okay? So funnily enough, many of the same people that promote English only in the United States also allege to be fiscal conservatives, but you couldn't have a less fiscally conservative action than throwing money at something that's already completely solid in its status. Then we heard a really interesting report about how top-down and bottom-up movements can have a synergy and lead to a reinvigorating of claiming one's ethnic identity. And I was struck by the use in that presentation of the term overpower, the language being overpowered. So this reinforces these power dynamics that exist among these languages in these multilingual settings. It was really nice to see what other areas have proven to be successful contexts where we saw the elders, sort of the traditional knowledge holders being paired or put together with the sort of, in some ways, most important stakeholders, that is the soon-to-be parental generation, who can, regenerate this new speaker generation. So, it was nice to see some of the results. One question I did have in that presentation was, they said they were awaiting the orthographic sort of sanctioning from the KWF. I was just wondering what the plans were to see how well that is implementable with the communities, because often once a small group of community members have come up with an orthography and you try to get it out into the broader group, man, you can get some pretty contentious and ugly attitudes getting expressed. So, yeah, orthography is a heavily political issue. So I'd be interested to see, and I wish you great success in the implementation of that. There might be a few stumbles in the road, but you'll get there, and you're on the right path. And as the last comment, I would say that I was also sort of struck in a sense by the embodiment of the language hierarchies at work, in that we had a bilingual presentation where we had people who were speaking English, whose native language was presumably not English, but some other Filipino language, or Filipino or Tagalog. I don't know what their native languages are, I don't want to assume. Whereas we had people who, we had some Tinagbagwa people speakers, Tagbanwa people speaking Tinagbanwa language, that were speaking in what I assumed was Filipino, being translated into English. Okay, so I must say that I cannot distinguish between the two. I don't know either language, so they both sound Austronesian or Philippine. So that's about as far as I could go. So again, we're seeing at play these different hierarchies and language power dynamics that exist and permeate all of our lives and interactions in this multilingual world we're trying to negotiate.
Thank you very much, Dr. Anderson. You may now be seated. And may we call on our panelists and our speakers for our question and answer portion. Dr. Michael Walsh, Dr. Salem Hood, and the members of the Translation Association, Translators Association of the Philippines, Dr. Josephine Daguman, Rosario Viloria, and our Tagbanwa sisters, Lerma A. Abella and Rodeline Aguilar. Para po sa mga magtatanong, manyari pong lumapit sa mikropono at magpakilala. Kung nais niyo pong ihain ang tanong sa Filipino, ay sasalin po natin yan on the spot. Kasama natin ang Translators Association of the Philippines.
I Hi, good afternoon. Thank you very much for this conference. I think it was highly stimulating. That's why I'm here. I am Dr. Season. I'm from the Philippine General Hospital. So I come from a totally different perspective, I think, from a lot of people here. Working on the premise that language is evolving and really a reflection of the social and evolving social zeitgeist. I know our topic is on endangered languages. My question specifically is, when you say language, and this probably might be a very basic question, are we only referring to verbal language versus language of communication in the age of social media, wherein you don't need face-to-face interaction anymore, wherein you send a text, you send an image, and that's one form of communication? Do you consider this dimension as part of language? And my second question is that I think language is indeed important, but the more important thing to highlight, in my opinion, the reason why endangered languages are important is because they enrich our experiences. As Filipino, I actually realize, admittedly so, I don't speak the language very well. But I think in doing so, I limit the nuances of the delicacy of the Filipino language. I think because of this, I'm inspired. So what I'm saying is that if we say language is the key in social interaction, which leads to social identity, that maybe with me as Filipino, I should appreciate a multidimensional identity, me being able to speak English, as well as the Filipino language, as part of a richer social identity.
Okay, go ahead, Dr. Anderson.
To anyone who would care to
react again. Yeah.
Microphone is not working very well. Can't hear very well. This one? That one, that one.
That microphone.
Yeah, we can't hear very well from
May we ask the tech booth to increase the volume? Yeah, and again, may we ask for the reiteration of the question in simpler terms? Yeah, in simpler terms.
Oh,
yeah, because of the sound problem.
Oh, okay.
The question itself.
Sure, I'll be happy to repeat my question. I want to be enlightened on a framework in terms of the operational definition of language. I do know the topic is endangered languages. However, my question is that with modern technology, with social media, we communicate through text, which is completely abbreviated, that is completely outside from the normal spelling of words. At least that's how we practice here. Is this considered part of language when it is not it's not verbally spoken? Is this considered language? And if not, what do we call it then? That's my first question. My second question is that I think one main reason why we need to preserve endangered languages is because of the richness of experience and nuances that I think it brings. But more importantly, you're able to sell that. If for me, for instance, I said, what relevance would it be for me if I appreciate my own identity in multi-level dimensional terms, wherein one will be English, one will be Tagalog, and one will also be endangered species. It therefore enriches and expands my identity as well.
I'm going to respond to what I think is the first question. So the issue arises as to whether endangered languages get used in new outlets like social media, email, Facebook, and so on. So in the talk this morning, I gave an example of Kamilaroi, which is an endangered language, where a virtual community has been created using Facebook. But even leaving aside social media, which personally I don't like very much, I embraced email 30 years ago when it was pretty difficult to use, and still use it. But social media, if people want to use it, then fine, go for it. I just want to spend my time on other things. Even talking face to face with people is quite good. But In the endangered languages environment, there are people who are, let's say, nervous about their ability to communicate in spoken terms, but they can send an email to someone in some language like Gamilaroi, Daruk from Sydney or whatever. They can spend 15 minutes composing the written email and then hit the button. The person at the other end doesn't know whether they've spent 20 seconds or half an hour. So that's a safe way of using media for a new purpose. The other issue, if I understand you right, is the extent to which people's lives are enriched by embracing an endangered language. One of the things I didn't talk about this morning, a whole lot of things I didn't talk about, but one of them was the thirst for endangered languages amongst non-Indigenous people. Each year there's a festival, the Festival of Sydney in January. In 2017, a new director of the Sydney Festival was appointed, who is an Aboriginal man himself. He decided to have a new thing starting in January 2017, which is called Talk Sydney. So the language of Sydney, which is Daruk. And the idea was that they would bring some people in to learn this language intensively over about a week. The initial event in 2017 was completely oversubscribed. I kept running into people, these are non-Indigenous adults, saying, I really wanted to go to that, but I got in too late. So in 2018, the program was greatly expanded, and in 2019, it's going to be greatly expanded again. Another example is, this one's not an endangered language, but to the extent that if I follow Greg, all sorts of things are potentially endangered. A language I mentioned in passing, Yolngumatta, has been taught, and this goes to the first question as well, it's been taught by distance education through Charles Darwin University, but the Aboriginal elder might be sitting under a tree at an outstation in a remote part of northern Australia. There's then a satellite link and Skype which beams the language lesson not just to people in Darwin, which is at least in the same territory, but also to Sydney, to California, and various places in Japan. When I last spoke, they were talking about beaming the language to Germany and Hungary, so there's this apparent thirst amongst non-Indigenous people to expand their linguistic repertoire.
I think I'll just have two brief comments to your questions, if I understood them. If you're texting and you're using non-literary conventions, that's just another convention that texters are setting upon. So whether you write you, Y-O-U, or you write you, it's still a representation of the spoken word you. So that doesn't really change. It's just a new conventionalization. Now, of course, there are non-spoken languages that are legitimate languages, and many of them are endangered. So there are many endangered sign languages, for example. They're amongst the most under-recorded and under-documented languages. Many have come into existence and disappeared with never being documented. Sign pigeons exist in many communities where you have a deaf member for a generation or something. So there's all kinds of interesting things there that aren't spoken. So, and the second question, linguistic identity is a complex thing. And if you're a monolingual speaker, you're only going to have one linguistic identity. If you're a multilingual speaker, you're likely to have multiple or amalgamated, complex. There's a lot of, for example, urban youth slangs and other things that are used which define individual groups and user communities, though they're, how to define them as grammatical systems or languages per se is not necessarily straightforward, because they're constantly negotiating multilingual utterances and things like this to construct this sort of cosmopolitan, urban, mixed linguistic identity. So yes, it's a very complex issue. So yes, you can conceive of yourself as a Filipino speaker or an English speaker, or you can think of yourself as a Shang speaker or whatever, right? So it doesn't really, doesn't matter in that sense, or all of them simultaneously.
Thank you. On that point, I think the whole thing is we're talking about multilingualism and endangered languages. The thing is, we talk about endangered language, we want to save a language that is dying. It doesn't mean that we have to do it to the detriment of the others, which is exactly the opposite of what we are fighting for. So multilingualism is actually great, to use a simple word. In fact, in many societies in Asia, in Africa, for instance, in West and Central Africa, people grow up speaking between, I was saying yesterday, I think, or this morning with people, they grow up as children, they start speaking 3 languages. And then when they reach adulthood, they end up speaking about 8 languages. Because very often they're small communities, they live next to each other, and you have one woman from one community, another woman from another community, and another man, from another community. Both of them are bilingual, at least, or trilingual, so they bring the languages, each bring their languages they know, and then their children will pick up the dominant language or things. They speak 2 or 3 at home already, they speak others in the street, and that's what actually enriches them. Multilingualism is not a problem. Multilingualism is actually, could be even a solution for humankind in a way. What is bad is when language or 2 languages, whatever, dominate all the others and basically lead to their exclusion and then probably their death. So, I viva multilingualism if possible. The other thing with the new media, obviously, it's still early days because we are in a period of transition with the new media, and there's a treasure trove of opportunity, and there's lots of dangers behind every corner, basically, with the new media, and. When you say if it's written, then is it a language? It's not a problem because most endangered languages are oral languages, and they're oral because they haven't had a written literature. It's a tautology, and they haven't had it because they haven't had the opportunity for political or other reasons. For once, the new media are giving them the opportunity to create their own written language. So in fact, there are a lot of people in small communities who have never written their own languages, and suddenly they have this thing and they can write it. Okay, in the beginning, each person sort of writes in their own little fashion, but then the convention creates, because otherwise they wouldn't understand each other. And then lo and behold, after one generation, then that language which was not written will be written in the new media. As I said, the problem with the new media, as we've seen even in the bigger politics, the so-called fake news and all that, it has dangers and it has opportunity. In fact, again referring to, I'm doing my commercial bit for the Foundation for Endangered Languages. One of the conferences that we had in 2001 in Morocco was about the media. And that's one, again, come up with the slogan that the media heals and the media kills. And the media can kill you as much as it can heal you. It gives you the opportunity and it opens the trap for you. Thank you.
Salamat po. At sa ikalawang tanong na tayo. At meron pa pong isasagot si Dr. Daguman, paumanin.
To the first question, as to whether language in the social media is part of the scope of this conference, the answer is yes. We might not have focused on it in our talks so far, but it is, because it is also language. And as to the connection of social media and the indigenous languages that are the likely candidates to be endangered, at this time in our country, when we are developing orthographies for our indigenous languages, part of the consideration is whether we could text those languages using the orthography. And we're happy to say that there are ways to text them now. So we see the future as bright. To the second question regarding multilingualism, as Filipinos, we are really rich because I don't think there's any one of us who is monolingual. I think every Filipino speaks at least 2 to 5 to 10 languages. So that's something to celebrate, the richness of our linguistic environment. And you are welcome to increase your linguistic repertoire.
Salamat po sa ating panel. Sa ikalawang tanong.
Hello. Okay. I'd like to first of all thank the panelists for your expertise. Okay, the first one is addressed to Dr. Walsh, and I was struck by your pronouncement in regard to suicide in Australia as well as racism. Now, I'd like or I'm rather wondering if racism, discrimination, and the percentage, or what is the percentage of suicide rate in Australia in connection with endangered languages? Now, is it because discrimination in regard to the employment of these people? Are they being discriminated because of their national origin, their age, or other forms of discrimination? And so you mentioned the cost of racism in Australia is $44.9 billion, and that's a high amount to begin with. And to reflect on what is happening in the states like the American Indians, suicide is also a big problem in America, as well as alcoholism. Now, the other question I'd like to point out is in regard to the attitude of Australians when it comes to the revitalization effort of the indigenous languages. And then thirdly, now there have been so many refugees in recent years that have been coming to Australia, whether they're Arabs, they're from Southeast Asia, or in other parts of the world. So in regard to one of what Dr. Masood said, that we have linguistic rights, or all people have linguistic rights. So how does Australia treat these new refugees or new population coming to Australia in regard to their linguistic diversity in that respect? Okay, so I'm sorry, I have another, if I can pass forward to Dr. Masood. Now, you also mentioned about language diversity as well as biodiversity, and I do agree with that. Any death in regard to the ecosystem, like our trees, their animals, the plants, okay, will have a corresponding death or demise in regard to people's languages. Their dialects, their languages will also be affected. Now, I'd like to point out to the public or to everyone in this conference. I am from Zambales in the town of Santa Cruz. I'm like a migrant there, an immigrant. I come from Pampanga as my native province. Okay, but the past several years, now the mining industry, 5 mining companies in the Philippines, and then with collusion of Chinese miners, companies, okay, they have desecrated, they have raped the mountains in Santa Cruz, and now they are going to do this ferro nickel plant in Candelaria. And now if you're going to look at our town, or the towns of Santa Cruz and Candelaria, now you're going to see the expand of the Zambales Ranges, beautiful mountains, and in my town, in Santa Cruz, they have already destroyed, okay, these mountains, and it has affected the lives of a lot of people in my town. And now this Chinese company is going to Candelaria, establishing this ferro-nickel plant, and that would even destroy not only the agricultural lands, not only the forest lands, the mountains, but even the drinking water of the people from Santa Cruz, from Masinloc, and also from Candelaria. Now, I'm bringing this out because we can do something about this. And if we will be strong enough, that's not only our languages, but our own people will die as a result of these mining companies. What they have done now in my town will also be happening throughout the world. And in fact, in all over the Philippines, we have seen a lot of these things have been happening, and even in other countries, like, for example, in Nigeria. Thank you.
I hope I can remember everything that was said. First of all, the issue of suicide, that's got a whole lot of questions within the question, but I think I've got to be short. Yes. First of all, why would Indigenous youth commit suicide? There are many reasons, but basically Aboriginal people or Indigenous people in Australia on all sorts of indicators are the most disadvantaged group of all. So they've got the highest mortality rates, child mortality, highest rates of imprisonment, massive unemployment. So there are youth who basically lose hope because they feel my white counterpart, who's no smarter than I am, he or she is going to get a decent job. I won't get a job unless I move a long way away from my own people, something that would tear you apart anyway. So there are many reasons why people might be tempted towards suicide, and what we've found is that the regaining of languages especially, or retaining of them, can reduce that level of youth suicide. Now, the second question,
on the attitudes of Australians regarding language diversity and racism.
right? Yeah, and what? Well, that was the third one, I thought. Yeah. I was
We
after the
should
second one.
package also the third
Okay, I'll
question,
do the
because
third one.
on the new refugees, the flux
Yeah,
of new
yeah,
refugees in
sure.
Australia.
I was thinking of that as the third one and I couldn't remember the second one, but anyway, I'll do the third one. Basically, I referred to a Filipino sailmaker, Antonio Cabillo, who went to Darwin in 1895, and his grandchildren are instrumental in the revival of the Larrakia language. That kind of intermarriage between Indigenous people and peoples, especially from Asia, has been going on for at least 100 years. So there are Chinese Aboriginal people, Japanese Aboriginal people, and Filipino people. Aboriginal people tend to be very tolerant of languages other than English, so they will embrace the migrants' language. But I mentioned the monolingual mindset in Australia. Many white, non-Indigenous Australians basically think that it should be English only, and to even learn another language at all, be it Japanese or French or whatever, is essentially a waste of time and money. So I don't think I've answered all of your questions, but there are parts of non-Indigenous Australia which are quite racist and dismissive of languages other than English.
And I guess on the issue of mining, we all know that mining destroys language and the culture it articulates. So I guess there should be a better and concerted effort among the Filipino people with regards to making the people accountable for the irresponsible mining taking place in our country.
I might just go to that issue of mining. There's a language which I won't mention by name, but it sits on a very rich deposit of manganese, and the Aboriginal view for many years has been that manganese that gets into the, well, hang on, the non-Indigenous perspective is manganese goes into the rainwater or the groundwater and creates all sorts of horrible diseases. The Aboriginal view is that that person died because he was ensorcelled, so people were casting spells on him or her. That's why they died. Now, which view is correct? Well, the Aboriginal people say it's obvious that it's spells being cast that causes the damage, and the non-Indigenous view is that it's manganese. So to the extent that manganese is the enemy, is there anything good that comes out of it? Well, yes, because the mining royalties from manganese in that particular case support very strongly, much more so than other language groups, their language maintenance and revival. So, you want to take it?
Yeah. Sorry, before I start, could I ask for a favor? Because first of all, we cannot hear very well the questions. And secondly, as Michael has just noticed, when you ask 5 questions, we forget them. So could you ask 1 or 2 short questions, and if possible, come back and ask more afterwards? Then we'll be able to answer.
Just 1 question or 2 questions?
Yeah, it's just that it'll help us answer the questions. Otherwise, you'll feel frustrated. Anyway, this wasn't my answer. No, I just wanted to just point at a little thing when we're talking about racism. I don't want to go into it, but let's not forget that discrimination based on language is one of the second most perceivable difference after skin color. And a lot of racism can be based on language as much as it is on skin color. The only thing is that if you don't open your mouth, people don't know what language you speak. Whereas you just go out to the street and then know what color is your skin. So it's the same in many ways, because racism is easy to apply to anyone who has prejudice. You find all sorts of things to be prejudicial about, and language is an easy one as well. The biodiversity thing, just want to clarify something. It's a complex thing, but most of the people who have been working on endangered languages and make this comparison between endangered languages and biodiversity, we say there is a comparison. Biodiversity, they're all the species, and where we look at language, if we talk about biodiversity as botanic species and animal species, and we're adding a different dimension, which is language is like a species, in fact. So it's not biodiversity and then language diversity separate. We just, my point anyway, my own opinion is that language diversity is part of the general biodiversity. First of all, most linguists notice that one of the causes of language endangerment and language death is actually the change in ecology. When the ecology changes, whether it's drought or anything like that, then people move, die, or the communities are basically disbanded and the language dies out. So there's a direct impact between real but natural ecology on language purification. But the other thing is that language diversity itself is made in the same vein and the same structure as the rest of material diversity or natural diversity. So my own opinion is that language diversity is part and not only similar. It's part of biodiversity in general. It's just one species we don't consider, like the botanical or whatever. And very quickly also, well, if that was quick, linguistic rights, it's not, at the moment, it's a concept. It's not ingrained, it's not enshrined in law. It's a concept which was developed by non-official bodies. Like the international law is developed by the UN, the European Union, the African Union, the American, all the regional things. Linguistic rights are still a principle which are upheld. So if you look at the period before the creation of the United Nations in 1945, after the First World War, before the UN was created, we were thinking of human rights, but it was still an idea which came from the Enlightenment, came from the philosophers of the Enlightenment, etc. But when the UN was created, they became law through the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and then the system. Linguistic rights is at this very embryonic stage, that they're still a concept, but they cannot become tangible law. They cannot become binding until we work for them. We lobby, we advocate, we agitate to make them happen. And this is the point. I'm probably going to be long, but I don't know if some of you know a famous American of the 19th century called Frederick Douglass. He was an escaped slave before the Civil War in the United States, and he became one of the most famous advocates of abolition. When later in life, after the war, he became the sheriff of Washington, D.C., became famous all over the world, a young student, people came for him for inspiration. A young student once came to him and said, Mr. Douglas, or sheriff, or whatever, what can you recommend a young man like me who wants to defend the rights of they didn't say African American at the time, they say black Americans, the rights of black Americans. What do you recommend I do? He said, young man, only one word: agitate, agitate, agitate. And this is part of the message that I think we should really care. We have to make it. Which brings me to a slightly contradiction. I want to correct what Gregory said earlier. We're talking about top-down when I was talking about the things. Yes, it is top-down because most of the world system is run by governments. The UN system, the European Union system, the African system, they're the ones. I mean, the UN is a club of governments, etc. It's top-down. But what we're trying to say is that let's make it bottom to top. This is the agitation, this is the work, this is what we want to do. We want to make linguistic rights. I was saying the Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples was done by indigenous peoples themselves. And it was different from the rest. That's what we want to do, reverse the trend. Make it bottom, because we're at the bottom, to the top. Yes.
In addition to what the colleagues have already expressed, yes, we know that language is not an isolated phenomenon that we have to deal with. Language is part of an entire ecology that includes our environment, the other species in life, industrialization, business, politics. So even though we as linguists, applied linguists, are focused on language issues, we try to make our service as holistic as possible. And for those areas where we can no longer address the language speakers' problem, we try to network so that the holistic need of the people we are serving are met.
Maraming salamat po. Sige po, sa ikatlong tanong. Magpakilala po at lakasan ng boses.
Yes. My name is Nora Gamolo and I'm a technical consultant for communication of the National Anti-Poverty Commission. First, let me express my appreciation for reminding us that linguistic rights are non-derogable rights, like the right to life, the right not to be tortured, the right to food, and the basic survival needs of human beings. Thank you very much also for sharing some of your experiences in language revival, language revitalization. Just the same, oh, by the way, since I'm involved in communication, let me now tell you outright that really linguistic rights should be considered as a very important component of anti-poverty initiatives in our country and in other third world countries too. My concern is that I'm just wondering if you want to start off a movement to revitalize dying languages, isn't this something that also requires a broad base of professionals who can provide the technical basis for such a movement? The people, of course, will provide the political basis, but I'm also thinking that this is probably something that requires a broad base of practitioners. So that means linguists, and I'm not exactly sure how broad is our base of linguistic practitioners in the country. Another thing, isn't this something also that probably requires, well, to start off a program, even if it concerns only small communities, but if this is going to be a broad movement, then there's probably a need for stable logistical funding to conduct researches, to conduct language familiarization, trainings and retrainings. So this is going to be considering well, some governments actually look at the other end of the social or issues of other socioeconomic issues, and probably will not be so predisposed to funding this. So maybe you can share with us some ideas and also your experiences about how language revitalization has taken off in other countries. Thank you. Oh, and thank you, by the way, to the people of Coron, because, well, of course, it's not so technically rich, but maybe you can give us more data and share with us, make your movement in Coron more popular. Maybe you could bring this to radio, TV, try to get the journalists to be interested in your story. Thank you very much.
Okay, there are a lot of questions in there. I think you said two.
Yeah, particular on the necessity for the base of practitioners on this campaign for revitalization, particularly linguists and other practitioners, and the stable logistical funding of this endeavor.
Well, in my talk this morning, I had a wish list of about 15 factors that could contribute to success in a language revival program. I put funding nearly last. And the reason for that is that the funding is nice if it happens, but if you don't have any funding, you can still make all sorts of progress. Getting practitioners that are suitable is an ongoing problem. There are some language revival projects in Australia where if one individual died for some reason or other, the whole thing might stop instantly and not get started again. So one of the things we've tried to do in Australia is to create more practitioners, and partly we do that through linguistics courses at various Australian universities where we encourage linguistic students to become engaged in the language revival process. In fact, next year, but the dates keep changing, there's going to be a workshop which is modelled on a program that started in Berkeley, California quite some time ago called The Breath of Life. And basically the idea here is that you bring some Aboriginal people or Indigenous people and put them together with a linguistic partner who then breathes life into the early manuscripts. And so you saw some of that early material I was talking about under the documentation and analysis section. So this will be the first time that such a program has operated in Australia, and we're expecting maybe 5 or more groups of Aboriginal people to come together, each with a linguistic partner, and so on. Another factor is at the University of Sydney, we created some years ago, I only had a small part to do with it, but the Masters of Indigenous Languages Education. This was a specialised degree specifically for Indigenous people, where despite the fact that I'm in linguistics and have been for a long time and love linguistics to bits, I was part of the design of this course, and we had sort of that much linguistics and that much language pedagogy and various other skills. I might say that at least half of the graduates of the Masters of Indigenous Languages Education are not doing anything to do with language, whether it's revival or whatever. So what happens? Well, they get a master's degree from a high prestige institution like the University of Sydney. They're offered a job that pays twice as much, but it has nothing to do with language. Is this a bad thing? No, because it's building capacity in Indigenous communities. If we didn't created a degree, a Masters of Generic Studies, which would give them skills like time management, computer literacy, research, training, etc., no one would do it. So the motivation to get this higher qualification was through their involvement in Indigenous languages. I want to say a little bit about top-down. This is partly just to annoy Salem, but my own experience is rather negative. You may have got the impression this morning that I am an optimist, and mostly I am, except for top-down stuff to do with language policy and so on. My own experience in the state of New South Wales, there was the state government had decided at some stage it would be a good idea to create a New South Wales state government policy for Aboriginal languages. It took years to create the document. In 2004, it was eventually passed. Built into it as a matter of law, in inverted commas, was the need after 5 years to have a review of this particular language policy. The 5 years went past and there was no review. Another 5 years went past and no review. Eventually the language policy disappeared off the World Wide Web, and because I was involved in the writing of it to some extent, I've got a copy of it, but other people don't. So my experience with language policy documents is don't spend a lot of time, or in my case, don't spend any time at all on language policy documents. Just get on with language revival, because that will actually produce something. No offence, man.
You were saying what I thought I said. Thanks. No, I was saying that it's been done top down all the time, yeah. And we should reverse the trend. Right. That's what I said 3 times.
Right, although only bottom-up movements often fizzle out. So in my mind, the really successful ones are when you get strong bottom-up movements with some support from top-down. That's the most effective.
That's why you use the institutions.
Yeah.
That's why you use the institutions. That's why the UN or the European Union or whatever. Yeah.
But America and Canada are filled with unsuccessful grassroots revitalization movements, there's basically a case study of what not to do that you could write based on many of those experiences. They've each failed in their own way, but there's been a lot of unfortunate starts and stops that weren't successful.
No, but that's the whole point. It's because we learn from experience, and this is the thing. We keep the institutions because we cannot live without the institutions. But those institutions are not born with a structure. We change the structures all the time. And most of the time, governors, governments in general, etc., have the upper hand and they decide that. But what we want to do is, the usual thing, government by the people, etc. We want to at least participate. We again, using sort of European hackneyed thing, it's a participative democracy. It's everybody, that the people who govern us work for us and not the other way around. But, I'm just, all this, waste of space. But it's just, when we're talking about experience, it's all over the place. The main thing is to be dogged about it. You know what you want to do. As you say, you revive it, all the languages. But if you're a linguist, you do linguistics. If you're a lawyer, you do law. If you're a historian, that's very important. That's why I'm saying we work together. And it reminds me of the whatever you do, how the money, whatever the, I don't know if it's Confucius or Sun Tzu who said that famous thing that became famous now. A journey of 1,000 li starts with one step. You have to make that step. And a language is only as good as the people who speak it. And it'll only be revived or be successful, etc., as the will of the people who speak it want it to be. but it's a fight. It's not going to happen just like that. So, sorry, I don't know if... yeah, so I'm just coming back to the question again, and it's the same thing. When we think, these are highfalutin ideas, perhaps the planet, etc., etc., but you have to begin, as Michael was saying, with reviving your language. And that's what the professionals of development, especially the non-governmental organizations, say. Think globally, act locally. You know that one. That's what all the development organizations say. But one thing that I think is a very good idea, which I hadn't actually thought about, is to think of the... I'm putting it in different words, but this is the last question. You all familiar with the Millennium Development Goals? That's the goals that were set by the United States, the United Nations Secretary General to achieve for improving education, fight world poverty, etc., by the year 2000. After the year 2000, 15 years later, some of those goals were achieved, or others were not. So they became the Sustainable Development Goals. And they're still on, and we're still waiting for them. But it's one thing, it's a great idea to think of putting language, endangered languages, native languages, mother tongues, etc., among the Sustainable Development Goals. I hadn't thought of it. Thank you very much for that. I think it's a great idea.
Sige po kay Dr. Taguman.
Thank you very much, ma'am, for the ideas that you have shared. And yes, we agree with you that we need to raise more specialists in the area of language, to sustain and develop the discipline and provide a scientific basis for the things that we do. But history has shown us that that alone is not enough. It has to be coupled with empowering people on the ground, empowering those who own the language. So we say that even though we develop academically in linguistics and applied linguistics, we also bring linguistics to the owners of the languages, because if they do the analysis themselves and discover the features of their language, then they get to own it, and the things that you own, you are able to protect and fight for.
Maraming salamat po. Bakit bago po ang ating ikatlong tanong, dagdag ko lang din po yung tungkol sa pondo or with regards to funding. We need a lot of funds, but right now, yung KWF po, ginagastos yung pondo. Halimbawa po, may dalawa po kaming proyekto. Una po, yung linguistic ethnography. Challenge din ito sa lahat ng mga linguists and cultural workers na to fill in the gaps sa studies on language here in the Philippines, because the Philippines is home to 130 languages. And also, we have the Bahay Wika, or Language House, which will be presented by Commissioner De Lima for the dying languages of the Philippines. And we've already launched one Bahay Wika in Abukay, Bataan. At sa totoo nga po ay kasama natin sila ngayon. Nais ko pong patayuin si Nanay Rosa mula po sa mga Aita, Magbukon. Kasama po natin sila. Doon po napupunta ang pondo po, ang buwis po ng taong bayan sa mga nanganganib po nating wika. At gusto po natin to have more language houses in the Philippines. Okay, sige po. Sa ikaapat na tanong, susunod.
Magandang hapon po. Ako po si Rosaline ng University of Santo Tomas. To balance the pendulum, I'll be asking a question to TAP. Natutuwa po ako na makita yung application ng binigay ng SIL. Kami po ay kaisa ninyo sa pagdodokumento. Ako po ay narito para manaliksik ng dokumento ng Aita Mag-Anchi na nakatira sa Bambantarlac. At isa sa mga challenges namin ay ang pagharap sa NCIP, FPIC. Ang tanong ko po, kayo po ba ay dumaan sa proseso na yon, at ano po ang mga challenges ninyo sa proseso ng pag-interview at FGD sa community?
Siguro po ang kaibahan ay hindi ito top-down. Ang request ay nanggaling sa komunidad. So ang mga elders mismo, ang mga matatanda ng komunidad ay siyang nagpahayag ng kanilang pangangailangan. At ang organisasyon, ang NGO, ay nag-respond lamang sa kanilang request. So, every step of the way, sinusunod po natin ang what is anthropologically and culturally sound. Tinitingnan po natin kung ano ang angkop sa komunidad at sinusunod po yun. So there is a lot of respect for the structure of the community, and it's waiting upon the people to express their need and responding to their needs. Ewan ko lang kung may masasabi ang aming mga kasamahan.
Nais magbahagi din na Lerma at Rodelino sa kanilang karanasan doon sa pag-aaral, no, sama-samang pag-aaral din ng komunidad, pati na rin po ng mga eksperto.
Gusto mo pang magbigay ng question para baka makasagot sila? Kasi galing sa kanila. Ang issue ng rights ay
okay. So
hindi
like,
gaano.
to my understanding, you did not go through the process of NCIP.
Ano
Yes.
po ba yung ibig sabihin ng proseso ng...
Kasi po kami po bilang isang mananaliksik, kami ay naatasan, no, under the mandate of the NCIP, FPIC. So we have really difficulty. I have my friend here, and I think most of the universities can attest to this. We really have difficulty. So now you're trying to, in my understanding, ma'am, kapag top-down, pwede po na walang process ng NCIP.
Top-down po o bottom-up?
Bottom-up, sorry.
Okay.
By Frank Smith. At tama po ba ang understanding ko?
Sa aming karanasan, sila ang nag-request, so nag-respond lang po kami.
Now thank you very much. You're giving me a new perspective on how we can document language without that process. Thank you, ma'am.
So, hindi naman siguro. Kung meron pala kayong alam na proseso, na sa tingin ninyo ay hindi namin nagawa, gusto din naming makinig ng ganon. Kasi, parang practice din namin at policy na talagang sumusunod kami sa lahat ng alam naming mga batas at nagre-respeto sa lahat ng mga ahensya ng gobyerno na kinakailangan naming ilayes.
Sobrang masaya na po ako na may bago akong kaalaman na natutunan mula sa inyo. Yun lamang po.
Okay po.
Good afternoon. I have one question for Dr. Michael Walsh and one question for Professor Saleh Masood. So first one, for Dr. Walsh, how do we measure the success of a language revitalization program, and how are we to know when a program is more effective than the other programs and that such a program deserves the support of the government? I ask this question because working and coming from the government, this is a question of priority, given that the government has limited resources. Okay, for Professor Masood, we learned from your presentation that a way to address the political and legal challenges is to consider the linguistic rights as a non-derogable rights. I believe that some of our participants here find the concept of non-derogable right a little vague and abstract. And how do we operationalize that concept, that non-derogable right, and how do we convert it into actions and outputs? Thank you.
Dr. Walsh?
All right. That's a difficult one. The governments, of course, will look to prioritise language revival efforts. In that wish list of success for language revitalisation programs, I've listed about 15 different factors, and basically the ones that are most successful have got pretty well all 15, and the ones that don't, sometimes a crucial one like community cohesion, that just stops the language revival project in its tracks. And what we've sometimes got to do is say, well, we just have to wait until people sort themselves out and begin focusing on language rather than land or mining or whatever else it happens to be. Now, going to government for support, when they ask you, well, which is the top priority, the honest answer is I don't know, but then I try to give some answer which more or less works at the time for the people I'm talking to. It's not a very satisfactory answer.
First of all, I want to reiterate that this campaign that I want to advocate in many ways is just my own idea. I don't think anybody has, either, even if they have thought about it, they have not brought it up publicly anyway. I know I've done that in 2004, and then since then people have been talking about it perhaps, but not officially. And then, having said that, it's perfectly natural that it remains an abstract, because if you're not familiar with the whole system of international human rights, etc., you may not know what it means. But suffice it to say that we're all familiar with the UN system of international human rights through at least the most iconic instrument of that, which is the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Most of the present system comes from that. That was the first thing when it's adopted. That means the new states, the new nations which were born out of the Second World War want to build a new world. And this new world should be based on principles on which everybody agrees. Obviously, this is just the surface, because in reality people don't agree and they fight about every article, etc. But once they finish that, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights is a set of principles which all members of the United Nations agree on. Any country which is not a member, which wants to join the United Nations as a member state, has to approve of the Universal Declaration of the Charter, otherwise they will not be admitted, because that's the fundamental principle of the international system. Having said that, as I said earlier, it's just a principle. This principle has been, applied into real law, which is binding on states. And the first ones were the Covenant on Economic, Social and Political Rights. The second one was the Economic, Social and Cultural Rights. After that, a lot of other international conventions were drawn from each one of those. And then, we have the conventions on refugees also, which predated that, but then were enriched afterwards. We have the convention, as I mentioned, some of them, like the Convention on the Rights of the Child, the Convention Against All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, for instance, CEDAW, the UN Convention Against All Forms of Racial Discrimination. There are over 100 of them. These are all, it's just like, think of national law. And these are laws, but they apply internationally and to states, not to individuals. They apply to individuals through states. But once this system has been designed in the principles, a lot of people thought, okay, a law can be amended, can be changed, and sometimes even if it's fundamental, you have a state emergency, for instance, in the country, whether it's drought or war, anything. The government declares a state of emergency. During that state of emergency, which is limited in time usually, i.e. 3 days or 4 days, but sometimes 15 years, some laws are suspended. Sometimes the constitution is suspended. That's the states of emergencies. What they said is that they picked up in the beginning half a dozen and then some others, and said these rights are so fundamental to the human being that you cannot deroge from them. Because if you do that, then the whole system sort of crumbles, basically. And so they're called non-derogable rights. Whatever the circumstances, they stay. You cannot deroge from them. So what I advocate is that linguistic rights can be one of those. We can add them to it. So that's the principle. If it's abstract, I'm sorry, but that's how these things work, and you have to work on that. The main thing then is how to. How did we get to the UN Declaration on the Rights of Minorities? How to get to the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples? Because sometimes it's a small NGO which started it. With the rights of the child, it was the Polish delegation to the UN in 1959, which said, look, our system is not very good because we confuse, we talk about adults, but children sometimes have different rights from adults. So why don't we start that? They put it, and that's a state, not an NGO, that's a state. They put it forward, the idea, in 1959. And a convention came out of it in 1989. So can you count how many years it's taken? It's a slow process. But and then an NGO boycott. What you do is you work on you create the work yourself with NGOs, with other people, with organizations. What you are doing, what the Commission is doing, what you're doing, everybody. And then when you work with everybody else, you push the idea. And one thing to do if you want to be practical about that is that if you're an NGO which is solid and whatever, you ask for observer status at the United Nations. The word is, you don't go to the United Nations, you go to the Economic, Social and Cultural Rights of the ECOSOC of the United Nations. That's the one that gives observer status to NGOs. When you have observer status with an NGO, then you can go to the UN and advocate any idea you want to advocate. So whether it's linguistic rights or minority rights or the right to grow beans in your own garden, you can do that. But it's the how-to. But I mean, there's a lot of things. We can talk about it later, and I can give you some pointers. But I just wanted to give the basic principles. Thank you.
Yeah. Meron din po akong tanong kay Lerma at kay Rodeline, lalo na dun sa kanilang ginawang pagtatrabaho para sa wikang tinagbanwa. Yung una, yung reaksyon ng komunidad, particular doon sa mga kabataan, kasi we should start young, di ba, doon sa involvement sa language, yung reaction, lalo na kayo ay nasa sector din ng kabataan. At yung mga tulong pa na posibleng maibigay ng pambansang gobyerno, ng pamahalaan sa inyo, na kung paano pa natin yung mga susunod nating tatahaking landas doon sa ating pagpanday sa wikang tinagbanwa. Una, yung reaction, yung sa komunidad, sa kanila kung paano natanggap. At ano yung reaksyon o yung ating mga maobserbahan na pagkilos sa kabataan, particular sa Coron.
Yung reaction po una, nung wala pang orthography, yung salita po namin ay natatakpan na po talaga. So, yung kahit yung nag-aaral sa amin, ginagamit Tagalog na, tas yung salita namin wala na, yung parang kinakahiya na. So yung dumating po yung orthography, malaki pong nagbago. Yung parang nabuksan po yung isip nila na kailangan wag natin itong parang ibaliwalain. Kasi po parang na-realize nila na napakahalaga po pala ng aming wika. So kailangan pa namin itong mawawala, kasi po naisip po nila na kapag tuluyang nawala yung namin, wala nang tagbanwa, wala na yung tradisyon, yung kultura po namin. Yun po.
At na-realize din po nila pag nawala po yung aming salita, hindi lang po salita ang mawawala sa amin. Tradition, culture, at lahat na po, mawawala na po yun sa amin. Lupa, yun po. At saka na-realize din po nila na yung salita po namin ay bigay po ng Panginoon, kaya po dapat po naming pangalagahan.
Maraming salamat. At dito po nagtatapos ang ating malayang talakayan, pero meron pa pong isang tanong mula kay Sir Tuting. Nakataas talaga siya gano'n. Yeah, bigyan na natin.
Hi, I'm Tuting Hernandez. I'm a historical linguist, a rather broad historical linguist from the University of the Philippines. My question is for Gregory. I have two questions actually. First is, I'm just curious about the status of Chilim right now and Sora. 10 years after you've done the documentation and revitalization of these two languages? So what worked and what didn't? And the second is, most of the hotspots that you identified, they're located in the global south. So is there a correlation between globalization and the capitalist expansion and the endangered language phenomenon? Because doing fieldwork in the Philippines, I've done fieldwork from the north to the south. Most of the languages really are suffering from endangerment based on intrusion of big business, which is followed by the militarization of the area. And that creates, or actually that destroys the speech community. So those are my two questions.
Okay. The first question is easy to answer. Chulim is nearly extinct. There's one fluent speaker remaining of the language, the Vasya Gabov, the guy in the film. We lost the second to last speaker about 2 months ago. Sora is thriving, actually. The areas where the language shift was happening, it's happened basically, and Sora is a classic example of a locally endangered language. So, in fact, it's extinct in some areas and thriving in others. So, it's doing quite well. The issue with Sora is Sora actually seems to be about 3 or 4 languages we've finally figured out now. There's a lot of different things in there that get called Sora that aren't really Sora per se, but are closely related languages. The second question about the global south and globalization, I actually don't think that's true because the vast majority of the most egregious endangerment areas are in the northern hemisphere. So you have Siberia and North America being actually the 2 worst places. And then you have Australia, which is the next worst, but it's good things are happening in Australia, and things are starting to turn up a little bit in North America as well. But yeah, I mean, as I said before, you have very clear legacies of both earlier historical processes that we conveniently call colonialization and more recent processes that are you could attribute to globalization, but if you take the sort of hierarchy, language hierarchy perspective, again, the access to the globalized culture, if it was truly a process of just a rote mechanical globalization kind of thing, then English would be replacing all languages everywhere, okay? Because that's what's sort of happening. When you say globalization, what you really mean is the spread of English in a way. And sort of Hollywood, Western constructed culture or something, okay? And so, yeah, to a certain degree that's true, but it's not through the vector of solely and only English. It is the dominant force in various countries linguistically and socially differs, and thus they're the vectors of the power that the mobility towards that the disenfranchised communities are striving to get to. Yeah, I mean, if you're looking to do international business or something, then English is going to be your target, okay? But if that's not your end game, then it's unlikely to be necessary to access certain benefits of a globalization culture that you may still abandon your native language, but you're more likely to be shifting towards the locally dominant language as opposed to a McDonald'sization of language, if you will, or whatever, which is, I think, what most people are. When people say globalization, I think they're like, why are there so many damn McDonald's everywhere, okay? That, or Starbucks or 7-Eleven, Pizza Hut, pick your American company that's been exported everywhere, okay?
Maraming salamat. We are also catching up with our Jollibees across the world, Dr. Gregory. Okay, this ends our, dito po nagtatapos ang ating Q&A because we're really pressed for time. Meron pa pong panahon para po sagutin ng ating mga tagapanayam sa ibang araw, sa ikalawang araw at ikatlong araw ang inyong